The hospital bustled with activity, its polished floors reflecting the hurried footsteps of doctors, nurses, and patients. In one of the brightly lit hallways, a young nurse stood near the doorway of a patient's room, trying her best to maintain composure. Her dark brown skin gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but her eyes betrayed a sense of exhaustion mixed with quiet determination. She had always been proud of her work, caring deeply for every patient who crossed her path. But today, something felt different, and that unease was about to grow into something much more serious. Inside the room, an older patient lay in the bed, watching the scene unfold with silent curiosity. The nurse had been attending to the patient when the doctor barged in, his presence filling the small room with an air of superiority. Dressed in his pristine white coat, the doctor barely acknowledged the nurse's presence as he scanned the chart in his hands. His demeanor was sharp, almost dismissive, as if he believed the nurse had no business being there. "Are you done yet?" the doctor asked, not bothering to look at her. His voice was cold, with an edge that sliced through the air like a knife. The nurse blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the abruptness of his question. "I was just finishing up, doctor," she replied, her tone polite but firm. She was used to working in high-pressure situations and had encountered difficult people before. But this felt different, more personal, perhaps. The doctor finally looked up, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with a disapproving gaze. "Finishing up? How long does it take to complete a basic task?" He scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. The patient, though lying quietly in the bed, shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the interaction. He sensed the tension, but said nothing for the moment. The nurse swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady despite the growing discomfort. "I'm making sure everything is in order for the patient's care," she explained calmly, her hands still adjusting the IV drip. She had been working with patients for years, and never before had she been spoken to like this in front of one. The humiliation was starting to sink in, but she refused to let it show. "Is that so?" the doctor sneered, stepping closer. He towered over her, using his height and position to intimidate. "Well, maybe if you spend less time chatting and more time doing your job, you wouldn't have to waste my time fixing your mistakes." The nurse's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Arguing would only escalate things, and she didn't want to create a scene in front of the patient. But the patient was no fool. He noticed the supple shift in her body language, the way her hands trembled slightly as she continued her work. "I'm not making any mistakes," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't someone to back down easily, but there was only so much disrespect one could take before it became too much. The doctor laughed, a short, cruel sound. "You're not. That's a first. From what I've seen, you people usually struggle with even the simplest tasks." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with an unspoken meaning that made the nurse's blood run cold. She didn't need to ask what he meant. It was painfully obvious. The patient, who had been silent until now, shifted again in his bed, his expression hardening. He had been listening carefully, taking in every word exchanged between the doctor and the nurse. Something flickered in his eyes, a spark of recognition, but he remained quiet for the moment, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The nurse, still holding back her anger, tried to focus on the task at hand. She had encountered racism before, but it never got easier. The pain was always the same, no matter how much she tried to brush it off. She knew better than to react openly. It would only give him more fuel for his insults. But the patient could see the struggle in her eyes, the way she clenched her jaw to stop herself from saying something she might regret. The doctor, oblivious to the tension building in the room, continued as if nothing was amiss. "Next time, let's try to be a little more efficient, shall we? The last thing I need is more delays because someone doesn't know what they're doing." He didn't even bother to lower his voice. It was as though he wanted the patient to hear every word, to see the nurse's humiliation on full display. The nurse's fingers tightened around the IV tubing, her knuckles turning white. She inhaled deeply, willing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not now. But the patient, now fully alert and watching every second of this, couldn't stay quiet any longer. He cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the thick silence like a blade. The doctor turned, momentarily surprised that the patient had spoken up. "I don't think you understand what's really happening here," the patient said softly, but his voice carried an undeniable authority. The doctor raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. The nurse glanced at the patient, her eyes filled with gratitude but also worry. She didn't want to drag anyone else into this, especially a patient. "And what exactly is happening here?" the doctor asked, crossing his arms. His tone was dismissive, as if he didn't believe the patient had anything important to add. The patient locked eyes with the doctor, his gaze unflinching. "You're making a mistake," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. "A big one." There was something about the way he said it, something that made the room grow even quieter. The doctor laughed again, though this time there was a nervous edge to it. "A mistake? I don't think so. I've been practicing medicine long enough to know when someone's wasting my time." But the patient didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his bed, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. "We'll see about that," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't think you realize who you're talking to." The tension in the room was palpable, as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. The nurse's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. What did the patient mean by that? Who was he? The doctor, still unaware of the storm brewing around him, shrugged dismissively. "I don't have time for games," he said, turning his back on the patient and waving a hand toward the nurse. "Just make sure you don't screw this up again." The nurse remained silent, but her eyes darted back to the patient, whose expression had shifted ever so slightly. There was a quiet confidence about him now, something that hadn't been there before. He knew something they didn't. Something that was about to change everything. The doctor, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, prepared to leave the room, but just as he reached for the door, the patient's voice cut through the silence once more, stopping him in his tracks. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," the patient said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority, "before you make a fool of yourself any further." The doctor paused, turning slowly to face the patient, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. The nurse watched, her breath held, as the patient prepared to reveal the truth that would leave the doctor reeling and the nurse vindicated. But for now, the truth remained just out of reach, hanging in the air like a dark cloud, ready to unleash a storm. And in that moment, the nurse realized that nothing in this hospital would ever be the same again. The room seemed frozen in time, the tension thick enough to cut through. The doctor stood at the door, his hand on the handle, still debating whether he should leave or stay. He was used to being in control, to having the final word in any situation. But something about the patient's calm, assured tone kept him rooted in place, unwilling to walk out without hearing more. The nurse stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what was coming next. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or anxious that the patient had spoken up. The doctor finally turned fully toward the bed, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What exactly do you think you're going to say that'll change anything here?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. His arrogance was still there, but there was a slight crack in his confidence, as if the patient's words had somehow unsettled him, even if just a little. The patient smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. He was an older man, with years etched into his skin, but his eyes held a sharpness that made him seem younger, more alert. There was something about him that commanded attention, something the doctor was beginning to notice. "Sometimes," the patient began slowly, "it's not about what you know, it's about what you assume." He glanced briefly at the nurse before shifting his gaze back to the doctor, his expression serious. "And right now, you're making a lot of assumptions." The doctor huffed, his frustration beginning to boil over. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his patience wearing thin. He didn't have time for riddles. "I don't have time for this." The patient leaned back into his pillow, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. "You think you know who I am. You think you know who she is," he said, nodding toward the nurse. "But you don't. You're judging people based on nothing more than appearances and stereotypes, and that's dangerous." The nurse felt a flicker of something. Was it gratitude? She wasn't used to patients standing up for her, especially not like this. But as much as she appreciated his words, she still didn't understand what he was getting at. Who was this man? And why did it feel like he was about to drop some kind of bombshell? The doctor shook his head, clearly annoyed. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't appreciate being lectured by a patient. I've been a doctor for years, and I know how to do my job." The patient chuckled softly, the sound almost mocking. "You've been a doctor for years, huh? And in all those years, have you ever stopped to think about how you treat the people who work beside you, Or are you too busy thinking about your title and your ego? The doctor's face flushed red, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You don't know anything about me, he snapped, his voice rising. You have no idea what it's like to be in my position. The patient's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. Don't I? He asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Are you sure about that? The room fell silent again, the air thick with unspoken tension. The nurse watched the exchange with wide eyes, her mind racing. There was something about the way the patient spoke, something that hinted at a deeper story, a hidden truth that neither she nor the doctor could yet grasp. The doctor, clearly uncomfortable, crossed his arms over his chest, his body language defensive. You're not making any sense, he said, his voice shaky despite his attempt to sound firm. The patient took a deep breath, his gaze softening slightly. Let me ask you something, he said quietly, his tone shifting to something more conversational. Do you even know who I am? The doctor blinked, taken aback by the question. You're a patient, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You're here because you need medical care. The patient nodded slowly, as if considering the doctor's words. That's true, but there's more to me than that. Just like there's more to her, he said, gesturing toward the nurse. You see, people are not just their jobs or their skin color. We're all more than the labels you put on us. The nurse felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent her whole career being judged, belittled, and underestimated by people like the doctor. It wasn't new to her, but hearing the patient speak so openly about it made something inside her stir, something she had kept buried for a long time. The doctor, however, wasn't ready to let go of his arrogance just yet. This is ridiculous, he muttered, shaking his head. I don't have time to stand around and debate life lessons with you. But the patient wasn't backing down. His eyes were locked on the doctor, unblinking, unwavering. You're making a mistake, he said again, his voice calm but firm. And if you don't listen to what I'm about to tell you, it's going to cost you. The doctor's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Cost me? What are you talking about? Are you threatening me? The patient shook his head slowly. No, he said softly. I'm warning you. The nurse could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the air thick with suspense. Whatever the patient was about to reveal, it felt like it would change everything, but there was still so much she didn't understand. The doctor took a step closer to the bed, his face flushed with anger. I don't take kindly to threats, old man, he spat, his voice low and dangerous. The patient remained calm, his gaze steady. It's not a threat, he said quietly. It's a fact. And once you hear it, you'll realize just how wrong you've been. The room fell into a tense silence once more, the air crackling with anticipation. The nurse's heart raced, her mind spinning with questions. Who was this patient, and what could he possibly know that would shake the doctor so deeply? The doctor, still visibly agitated, stood over the bed, his fists clenched at his sides. He was ready to walk out, to brush off everything the patient had said. But something in the patient's eyes kept him from moving, kept him locked in place, waiting for the revelation that was about to unfold. The patient took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. You don't know who I am, he said again, his voice steady. But after today, you'll never forget me. The nurse held her breath, her eyes flicking between the doctor and the patient, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Whatever was coming next, it was going to change everything. And in that moment, the doctor realized that the world he thought he knew was about to be turned upside down. But for now, the truth remained hidden, just out of reach, waiting to be unveiled at the perfect moment. The doctor stood frozen, the weight of the patient's words beginning to sink in. There was something in the patient's tone, something that made him doubt everything he thought he knew. His eyes darted briefly to the nurse, who stood silently by the bedside, her gaze shifting between the two men. She too seemed unsure of what was coming next, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope that maybe, just maybe, someone in this room saw her for who she really was. The doctor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Enough with the riddles, he said, though his voice lacked the strength it had earlier. If you have something to say, say it. I don't have time for games. The patient nodded slowly, his expression calm but serious. You're right, he said quietly. It's time I tell you the truth. The nurse watched closely, her heart racing. She had seen countless patients come and go, each with their own stories, their own struggles. But never had she been in a situation like this, where the truth seemed to hang in the balance, threatening to tip everything over. Who was this man? And what could he possibly know that would shake the doctor so much? The patient leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. You're looking at me and assuming I'm just another old man in a hospital bed. But there's more to me than meets the eye. Much more. He paused, his eyes flickering toward the nurse for just a moment before returning to the doctor. And if you keep treating people the way you treated her, he nodded toward the nurse, you're going to find yourself in a world of trouble. Sooner than you think. The doctor shifted uncomfortably, his posture tense. He was no stranger to difficult conversations, but this felt different. It was as if the ground beneath him was slowly crumbling, and he couldn't figure out why. What's your point? He asked, his voice hard, but with a hint of uncertainty. The patient smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with something the doctor couldn't quite place. My point, he said softly, is that you have no idea who you're dealing with. You think you're the one with all the power, all the authority. But that's not how the world works. Not anymore. The nurse, still standing quietly beside the bed, felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For so long, she had endured the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, disrespect that came with her job. She had grown used to doctors like this one, men who saw her as little more than a body in scrubs, someone to fetch tools and clean up after their messes. But now, for the first time, someone was standing up for her in a way she hadn't expected. It was both unsettling and empowering at the same time. The doctor, clearly frustrated by the patient's cryptic words, crossed his arms over his chest. You're still not telling me anything, he said sharply. What are you trying to get at? The patient sighed, his eyes softening slightly. I could tell you who I am, he said, but I don't think that would make much difference right now. What matters is how you're treating the people around you, the people who are supposed to be your team. You think because you wear a white coat, you're above everyone else. But the truth is, without people like her, he glanced at the nurse again, you wouldn't be able to do your job at all. The doctor's face flushed red, his frustration bubbling over. I don't need a lecture on how to do my job, he snapped, his voice rising. I've been in this field long enough to know how things work. The patient didn't flinch. He simply watched the doctor, his gaze steady and unblinking. Have you, though? He asked quietly. Have you really taken the time to see what's happening around you? Or are you too focused on your own status to notice? The doctor opened his mouth to respond. The words caught in his throat. Something about the patient's calm demeanor, the way he seemed so sure of himself, made the doctor hesitate. He was used to being in control, to having the final say. But now, in this small, sterile room, he felt something slipping through his fingers. The nurse, who had been listening silently, couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. For so long she had been overlooked, her contributions minimized by people like this doctor. But now, with the patient's words hanging in the air, it felt as if the balance of power had shifted, if only for a moment. But the patient wasn't finished. He leaned back into his pillow, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. You see, he began, there's a difference between being in charge and being a leader. A leader listens. A leader respects the people around them. A leader knows that they don't have all the answers. And that's okay. But someone who's in charge, they think they know it all. They think they can treat people however they want because of their title. The doctor's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to being talked to like this, especially not by a patient. But the words were hitting a nerve, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The nurse shifted slightly, her mind racing. She couldn't help but wonder what the patient's story was. Why did he speak with such authority? And what had he seen or experienced that made him so certain about these things? The patient smiled again, though this time it was more somber. I know people like you, he said softly. I've worked with them my whole life. People who think their position makes them untouchable. But trust me when I say, everyone answers to someone. The doctor, still standing stiffly by the door, felt a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of his neck. He didn't like where this conversation was going, but he couldn't seem to stop it. His mind was racing, searching for a way to regain control, to put an end to this uncomfortable situation. But the patient wasn't done. He glanced at the nurse again, his expression softening. You don't deserve this, he said quietly. You're good at what you do, and you deserve to be treated with respect. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." The nurse felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions swirling in a confusing mix of gratitude, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had spent so long trying to brush off the daily slights, the casual dismissals from doctors like the one standing before her now. But hearing someone say the words out loud, hearing someone acknowledge her worth, it felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. The doctor, sensing the shift in the room, clenched his teeth. He wasn't ready to back down, not yet. "I don't need to be lectured by a patient," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You don't know anything about me or how I run my practice." The patient's eyes darkened slightly, a shadow of something deeper passing over his face. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I know enough to see what's happening here, and if you don't change your ways, it's going to come back to haunt you." The room fell into silence once more, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The nurse stood still, her eyes wide, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever was coming next, she could feel it building, like a storm on the horizon. But the patient simply closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a softness there, a gentleness that hadn't been present before. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said softly. "I'm just here to remind you that everyone, no matter who they are or what they do, deserves to be treated with dignity, even if you think you're above them." The doctor remained silent, his thoughts swirling as he struggled to process what was happening. He had come into this room expecting a routine check, another day at the hospital. But now, everything felt different, unsteady, like the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he couldn't quite understand. The nurse, too, was left in a whirlwind of emotions. For so long, she had been told to stay quiet, to keep her head down and do her job. But now, with the patient's words echoing in her mind, she couldn't help but feel a spark of something new, a determination to stand up for herself, to demand the respect she had always deserved. But for now, the tension remained, unresolved and heavy in the air. The doctor, still standing by the door, was left with more questions than answers. And the patient, though calm and composed, seemed to know that the storm was far from over. And so, the room remained still, the truth lingering just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. The doctor stood motionless, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on his shoulders. The tension in the room had grown unbearable, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. He had spent years mastering his craft, honing his skills, and rising through the ranks of the medical field. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. He felt small, insignificant even, standing before a patient who spoke with such conviction, with such quiet authority. The nurse remained still beside the bed, though her thoughts raced faster than ever. The patient had managed to articulate the things she had always felt but had never been able to express. She had grown so used to the condescending tones, the dismissive gestures, that it had become part of the background noise of her life. But now, hearing someone challenge the doctor's authority so directly, it was like seeing a glimpse of a reality she had almost forgotten was possible. She had been strong for so long, enduring the subtle slights, the quiet humiliations, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to anymore. The doctor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the patient, then back at the nurse. He could feel his control over the situation slipping, and it terrified him. He had built his career on being the one in charge, the one who always had the answers. But now, in this room, that confidence was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. "I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here," the doctor said finally, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier. "But this isn't going to change anything." The patient smiled faintly, the kind of smile that spoke of experience, of seeing things far beyond the confines of this room. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. "It already has." The doctor blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in the patient's voice. How could a simple conversation have this much power? He glanced again at the nurse, suddenly aware of how silent she had been. She stood with her arms folded across her chest, her expression unreadable, but there was something different in her posture, something stronger, more assured. It made him uncomfortable. The power dynamic he had always taken for granted was shifting, and he could feel it slipping out of his grasp. He had to regain control, to reassert himself before things got further out of hand. "You don't know me," the doctor said, his voice harder now, more forceful. "You don't know what I've had to go through to get where I am. I worked hard for this, harder than you could ever imagine." The patient's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a calmness that seemed almost unsettling. "I'm sure you did," he said softly, "but that doesn't excuse how you treat people." The doctor felt his frustration growing. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by a patient. "I'm not here to win anyone's approval," he snapped. "I'm here to do my job." The patient nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "And how you do that job, how you treat the people who help you do it, that's what defines you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You think your title makes you untouchable, but the truth is, the people around you see everything. And one day, those small slights, those dismissive words, will come back to haunt you." The room fell silent again, the weight of the words hanging in the air. The nurse, still standing quietly, felt a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. It was as if everything she had ever wanted to say, all the things she had kept bottled up for so long, were finally coming to the surface. The doctor, however, was struggling to keep his composure. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never letting anyone see his vulnerability. But now, standing in front of this patient, with the nurse silently watching, he felt exposed in a way he had never felt before. "I don't need to be lectured by you," the doctor said, his voice rising slightly. "You don't know anything about me, or what I've been through. You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job?" The patient remained calm, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. "It's not about telling you how to do your job," he said quietly. "It's about reminding you that every person in this room matters. You may not see it now, but the way you treat people will come back to you, whether you like it or not." The doctor's hands clenched at his sides, his frustration boiling over. "I don't have time for this," he said sharply, turning toward the door. "I have real patients to see." But before he could take another step, the patient spoke again, his voice steady and unyielding. "You think you can walk away from this," he said softly, "but the truth is, you can't. You can't outrun what's coming." The doctor stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about the patient's words, something in the way he said them, that sent a chill down his spine. He turned slowly to face the man, his face pale. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice quieter now, his bravado faltering. The patient's gaze was unwavering, his expression calm but serious. "I told you before," he said. "You don't know who I am, but soon, you will." The nurse felt the tension in the room spike, the air thick with anticipation. She didn't know what the patient was planning, but whatever it was, she could feel that it was going to change everything. The doctor, once so confident, was now visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The patient leaned back into his pillow, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. "You've built your career on being in control," he said quietly. "But that control is an illusion. And once it's gone, once you realize that you don't hold all the power, you're going to have to face the truth about who you are." The doctor swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had come into this room expecting a routine interaction, another day at work. But now, everything felt different, uncertain, unstable. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface. "I don't have to listen to this," the doctor said, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned again, his hand reaching for the door. But the patient's next words stopped him in his tracks. "You think you can walk out of here and go back to your life," the patient said softly, "but you can't, because everything is about to change." The doctor froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. His mind was screaming at him to leave, to get out of the room and away from the patient's cryptic words. But something kept him rooted in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The nurse watched in silence, her own emotions swirling in a whirlwind of anticipation and uncertainty. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel the tension building to a breaking point, like a dam ready to burst. The doctor turned slowly, his face pale. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The patient smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with something the doctor couldn't quite place. "You'll see," he said quietly, "soon enough." The room fell into a heavy silence once more, the air thick with unspoken tension. The nurse's heart raced, her mind spinning with questions. Whatever was coming next, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. And in that moment, the doctor realized that the control he had clung to for so long was slipping through his fingers. The patient's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he felt truly vulnerable, unsure of what was coming next. But whatever it was, he knew he wasn't ready for it. Not yet. The doctor stood frozen by the door, every instinct screaming at him to leave the room. But the patient's calm words, the cryptic promises of something bigger, held him in place. His mind whirred, trying to make sense of everything that had just transpired. This was supposed to be a simple visit, just another patient on his rounds. Yet something was pulling him deeper into a situation that felt far beyond his control. The nurse, still standing nearby, felt the same tension swirling in the air. It wasn't just about the way the doctor had treated her, though that had certainly fanned the flames. There was a sense that something much larger was at play, something that both she and the doctor had been blind to until now. She couldn't help but feel that this moment was a tipping point, not just for her, but for the doctor too. The patient had come in quietly, but his words had shaken the very foundation of the room. The doctor's hand still hovered near the door, trembling slightly. He turned back to the patient, his voice shaking now, no longer the confident authority figure he had been minutes earlier. "What are you talking about? What's going to change?" His words came out quieter than intended, and for the first time in his career, he felt exposed. This wasn't a medical problem he could solve with knowledge or experience. This was something else entirely, something he didn't understand. The patient didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch out, intensifying the weight in the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You've been walking through your life, thinking you're untouchable," he said softly, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "But the truth is, you don't know what's happening around you. There's a whole world beyond these hospital walls, and you've been too blind to see it." The doctor frowned, confusion mixing with the fear that had begun creeping into his chest. "What does that mean? What are you?" Before he could finish, a sudden knock at the door interrupted the tense exchange. The sound was sharp, echoing loudly in the quiet room. The doctor flinched, visibly startled, his nerves already frayed. He hadn't been expecting anyone else, and the timing of the knock felt off. He turned toward the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Standing in the doorway was a man the doctor didn't recognize, wearing a crisp suit that was out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital. His presence immediately felt strange, as if he didn't belong here. The man smiled faintly, though there was something unsettling about it. "Good afternoon," the stranger said smoothly. "I'm here to see the patient." The doctor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of this new figure. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "I wasn't informed of any additional visitors." The man's smile widened slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "I didn't think you would be," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. His eyes flickered briefly toward the patient, who remained quiet, watching the interaction with an almost eerie calm. The doctor felt his pulse quicken. Something about this man's arrival set off alarms in his mind, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The nurse, who had been watching everything unfold, shifted uneasily, sensing the rising tension in the room. She didn't know who this new person was, but his sudden arrival didn't feel right. The man stepped closer to the bed, ignoring the doctor's presence entirely now. "It's time," he said quietly to the patient, his tone full of meaning that the doctor couldn't grasp. The patient nodded once, as if they had been expecting this all along. "What's going on here?" the doctor demanded, his voice louder now, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Who are you, and why wasn't I told about this?" The man turned to face the doctor, his expression unreadable. "You're not in control here," he said simply. "Not anymore." The words hit the doctor like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had always been the one in charge, always the one calling the shots. But now, standing in this room, with this stranger calmly telling him otherwise, he felt that familiar sense of powerlessness wash over him again. The very thing he had spent his life avoiding was now staring him in the face. The nurse, who had remained silent for so long, finally spoke up, her voice low but steady. "What is this about?" she asked, stepping forward slightly. "Why does it feel like none of this is what it seems?" The man glanced at her briefly before turning back to the patient. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "All of you will." The doctor's frustration boiled over. "I demand to know what's happening here," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "This is my hospital, my patient, and I deserve to know what's going on." But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he simply looked at the doctor with a kind of cold detachment. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said quietly. "What you should be asking is how much longer you can keep pretending that you're in control." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, and the doctor felt the ground beneath him shift once again. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle, but nothing made sense. How had things spiraled so far out of his grasp? And what did this man mean about control? The patient, who had remained calm throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up again. "You were right about one thing," he said softly, addressing the doctor. "Things are going to change, but it's not the kind of change you were expecting." The doctor swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his voice was barely a whisper now. The patient glanced at the man standing beside him, then back at the doctor. "You've spent your whole life building walls," he said. "Walls between you and the people around you, walls that protect you from facing the truth. That those walls are coming down, whether you like it or not." The nurse felt a chill run down her spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the patient's words, as if they were more than just metaphorical. The man's arrival, the cryptic conversation, it all felt like the prelude to something much bigger, something that would ripple far beyond this hospital room. The doctor, however, was too caught up in his own fear to fully understand. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "None of this makes any sense." The man in the suit finally turned to leave, but not before glancing back at the doctor one last time. "You'll see soon enough," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "The truth is coming, and you can't stop it." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed down on everyone like a weight. The doctor stood there, breathing hard, his mind swirling with confusion and fear. The patient's cryptic words echoed in his ears, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. The nurse, too, felt the weight of the moment, her own emotions a storm of uncertainty. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than any of them had realized. And as the patient lay quietly in the bed, watching them both with a knowing gaze, she couldn't help but feel that they were on the edge of something monumental, something that would change everything they thought they knew. But what that was, neither she nor the doctor could predict. All they could do was wait, the tension building, the unspoken promise of something more hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The silence that followed the man's exit lingered, thick and suffocating. The doctor stood by the door, still reeling from everything that had just transpired. His hands trembled as he stared at the patient, who remained unnervingly calm. The nurse, though quiet, felt the tension in the room crackling like electricity. It was as if the walls were closing in, the air charged with something neither of them could fully understand. The doctor's mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic words, the strange visitor, and the looming feeling that something bigger was at play. But no matter how hard he tried, nothing fit. He had always prided himself on being able to control every situation, but this time he was lost. His entire career, his status, none of it seemed to matter in the face of what was happening. The patient broke the silence, his voice steady and calm. "I know this is hard to process," he said, his eyes locked onto the doctor's, "but the truth has a way of catching up to all of us. You've spent years building a fortress of authority around yourself, convincing yourself that you're untouchable. But you're not." The doctor's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anger rising within him. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "What truth?" The patient sighed softly, a look of deep understanding in his eyes. "You've hurt more people than you realize," he said. "The way you've treated others, your arrogance, your disregard for those around you, it doesn't go unnoticed. You may not have seen it, but the people you've wronged remember. And one of them is much closer than you think." The doctor frowned, his confusion deepening. "What does that even mean? Who are you?" The patient didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted slightly in the bed, his gaze moving to the nurse. She stood there, watching the interaction unfold, her own emotions a storm of uncertainty and anticipation. But as the patient's eyes met hers, a realization flickered in her mind. Something was about to change, something that would alter everything she thought she knew. The patient turned back to the doctor, his expression somber. "You don't recognize me," he said softly, "but you should." The words sent a chill down the doctor's spine. His mind scrambled to piece together the puzzle, to figure out who this patient really was. He searched his memory, trying to recall every face he'd seen in the hospital over the years, but nothing clicked. I don't understand, the doctor stammered, his voice faltering. Who are you? The patient's eyes darkened, and for the first time, there was a hint of something deeper, something raw and painful. You once treated someone very dear to me, he said quietly. Someone who trusted you, who believed in your ability to help. But instead of care, they were met with your arrogance, your cold dismissal. And because of that, they're no longer here. The nurse felt her breath catch in her throat. She could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, the deep pain behind them. The patient wasn't just speaking out of anger. This was personal. She could see it now, the heartbreak that lay beneath his calm demeanor. The doctor's face went pale, his heart racing as the realization began to dawn on him. I didn't. He stammered, struggling to find the words. His mind flashed back to countless patients, to moments when he had been too quick to dismiss concerns, too wrapped up in his own ego to truly listen. But he couldn't pinpoint this specific situation, couldn't remember the face of the person the patient was referring to. You didn't think twice, the patient continued, his voice low but steady. You saw them as just another case, another name on your schedule. But to me, they were everything. And because of your carelessness, they're gone. The doctor staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him. I didn't mean to, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know. The patient's gaze hardened. That's the problem, he said. You never knew. You never cared to know. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. The nurse's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She had seen the doctor's arrogance, his dismissive attitude, but she had never imagined the consequences could be this devastating. And now, standing in the middle of it, she could feel the depth of the patient's pain, his desire for justice, for closure. But just when it seemed like the full truth had been laid bare, the patient spoke again, his voice taking on a new edge. You're not the only one responsible, though, he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the nurse. There's more to this story than you realize. The doctor frowned, confused. What are you talking about? What else could there be? The patient's gaze settled on the nurse, and for a long moment, the room was silent. The nurse felt a cold wave of dread wash over her as she realized what was coming next. You stood by and watched, the patient said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. You saw what was happening, but you said nothing. You let it happen. The nurse's breath caught in her throat. She had always prided herself on being compassionate, on caring for her patients. But in that moment, she realized that she, too, had played a role in the tragedy that had unfolded. She had seen the doctor's arrogance, had witnessed his dismissive behavior, and yet she had remained silent. She had been complicit, even if unintentionally. I didn't, she whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't know. The patient's expression softened, but the weight of his words remained. You may not have known the full extent, he said quietly, but you knew enough, and sometimes silence is as harmful as action. The nurse felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had always thought of herself as someone who made a difference, who helped people. But now, standing in the middle of this unfolding tragedy, she realized that she had failed. Not just herself, but the patient and the person they had lost. The doctor, too, was struggling to process everything. His mind raced, filled with regret and confusion. He had built his career on the belief that he was saving lives, but now he was faced with the reality that he had cost someone theirs. And just when it seemed like the full weight of the truth had been revealed, the patient dropped the final, devastating twist. I wasn't just any relative, he said, his voice quiet but clear. I'm the one funding this hospital. The doctor's face went pale. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The man he had so carelessly dismissed wasn't just another patient. He was the very person responsible for keeping the hospital afloat. And now, the tables had turned. You thought you were untouchable, the patient said softly. But now, everything's going to change. The room fell into a heavy silence once more, the enormity of the revelation settling over them all. The doctor stood there, his entire world crashing down around him, while the nurse struggled to come to terms with her own role in the tragedy. The patient, calm and composed, watched them both with quiet resolve. And as the tension finally broke, leaving them all in stunned silence, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The room was thick with the weight of the revelation. The doctor's face had drained of all color, his mind still trying to catch up with what the patient had said. He wasn't just anyone, he was the person funding the hospital, the one who had the power to change everything. The doctor's arrogance had blinded him, but now it was all coming into focus. His career, his reputation, everything he had built could crumble in an instant. The nurse, standing a few steps behind, could feel the gravity of the moment. She had been so caught up in the chaos of the hospital, the daily grind of caring for patients, that she hadn't allowed herself to see the cracks. She had known there were times when the doctor's behavior was unacceptable, but she had turned a blind eye, convincing herself it wasn't her place to intervene. Now, as the truth stared her in the face, she felt the sharp sting of regret. The patient, still lying in the bed, didn't move. His words had left a deep scar in the room, and there was nothing more to be said. He had watched long enough, seen the pain unfold, and now it was time for justice. But his face didn't carry anger. There was a quiet sadness behind his eyes, a tiredness that came from years of carrying a burden that no one else could see. He had lost someone dear to him because of the doctor's negligence, and no matter what happened next, that loss would always be with him. The doctor finally found his voice, though it was shaky and weak. "I didn't know," he whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. He knew deep down that this excuse didn't matter anymore. Whether he had known or not, the damage was done. His arrogance, his unwillingness to listen to those around him, had led to this moment. "You didn't care to know," the patient said softly, his eyes locking with the doctor's. "That's the difference." The doctor felt the weight of those words settle over him. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was the best, that his way was the only way, that he had never stopped to truly care about the people who came through his doors. They were just cases to him, puzzles to solve, names on a chart. And now, faced with the consequences of that mentality, he couldn't hide from it anymore. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, his voice barely audible. It was the first time in a long while that those words had left his lips, and even as he spoke them, he wasn't sure if they would ever be enough. The patient's eyes softened slightly, but the pain in them was still evident. "Sorry doesn't bring back the people we lose," the patient replied quietly. "But maybe it's a start." The nurse, who had been silent for so long, finally stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I should have spoken up," she admitted, her eyes brimming with tears. "I saw it, I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know how to stand up to him." Her words hung in the air, filled with guilt and remorse. She had been complicit in her silence, allowing the doctor's behavior to go unchecked, and now the consequences were staring her in the face. The patient looked at her, his expression softening even more. "It's hard to speak up when the system around you makes you feel powerless," he said gently. "But it's important to remember that silence can be just as dangerous as the wrong actions." The nurse nodded, tears now falling down her cheeks. She had always thought of herself as someone who cared, someone who did the right thing. But now she realized that caring wasn't enough if she didn't act on it. The patient's words were a painful reminder of the power of speaking up, even when it felt like no one would listen. The doctor, still standing by the door, seemed smaller than before. The confidence he had always carried, the air of superiority, had vanished. He was just a man now, a man who had made mistakes, who had hurt people, and who had to live with that knowledge. He couldn't go back and fix what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could change moving forward. "What happens now?" the doctor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The patient looked at him for a long moment, then glanced around the room. "That's up to you," he said simply. "You can keep living the way you've been living, or you can take this as a chance to change." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The doctor knew that this was a turning point, a moment where he had to make a choice. He could continue down the same path, relying on his arrogance and authority to shield him from the consequences of his actions, or he could take this moment as a wake-up call. He could choose to be better. The nurse, too, felt the weight of the patient's words. She had always believed she was doing enough, but now she knew she could do more. She could stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. She could make sure that the people who came through the hospital doors were treated with the care and respect they deserved. "I'll do better," the nurse said softly, her voice full of conviction. "I'll speak up. I won't let this happen again." The patient smiled faintly, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. "That's all we can ask for," he said quietly. The doctor, still struggling with his own guilt, nodded slowly. He wasn't sure how he could fix all the damage he had done, but he knew he had to try. "I'll change," he said, though the words felt fragile on his lips. "I have to." The room fell into a soft silence, the tension that had filled the air slowly dissolving. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still scars that would never fully heal, still pain that would linger, but there was a sense of possibility. The patient had spoken his truth, and now it was up to the doctor and the nurse to decide how they would move forward. As the nurse helped the patient settle back into the bed, the doctor stood there, watching, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He had never thought he would be in a situation like this, where his authority, his power, would mean nothing in the face of the truth. But here he was, forced to confront the consequences of his actions, forced to reckon with the fact that being a doctor wasn't just about knowing the right answers. It was about listening, about caring, about understanding that every person who came through the doors was more than just a case. The patient, now resting more comfortably, closed his eyes. His mission wasn't complete. There were still battles to fight, still people to hold accountable, but for now, he had said what needed to be said. And that, in itself, was a small victory. The doctor and the nurse left the room in silence, the weight of the moment following them out into the hallway. As they walked, side by side, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They couldn't undo what had been done, but they could choose to be better moving forward. They could choose to listen, to care, to stand up when it mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the day came to a close, the hospital continued to hum with the usual sounds of life. Patients coming and going, nurses tending to their rounds, doctors consulting with one another. But for the doctor and the nurse, everything had changed. The lesson they had learned wasn't just about one patient. It was about every person who walked through the doors, every life they touched. And from that day forward, they would never look at their work the same way again. In the end, the story wasn't just about the patient, or the doctor, or the nurse. It was about the power of accountability, importance of speaking up, and the recognition that every action or inaction has consequences. And as the hospital lights dimmed for the night, the echoes of that lesson lingered, a reminder that change was always possible if only they had the courage to embrace it. With the weight of the day behind them, the doctor and nurse shared a brief glance, an acknowledgement of the journey they were now on. There would be no going back, only forward. And while the path ahead would be challenging, it was a path they were ready to walk. Because sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one that leads to change.